Hey, welcome, Zara, investor and head of platform at Emerge. It'd be great if you could start by telling us a bit about yourself and Emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for having me. As you mentioned, I'm an investor and had a platform at Emerge, and we are a global venture capital fund, and we invest in early stage companies building the future of learning and work. I've been there for over 3 years now, and though we have an office in London, I'm not based there. I have been living out of a suitcase well before I joined Emerge, actually, and I move country every 1 to 2 months. Coming back to Emerge, we invest in companies that democratize access to opportunity by empowering people to access the skills and knowledge they need at the lowest possible cost. We closed our second fund back in November of last year, which is a $73 million fund, focusing on investing in companies that use AI to transform how we learn, navigate life, and work. The last thing I add there is the thing I love most about Emerge, and actually this applies to everyone we work with as well, is they all have a story about why they're in the space. And for my team in particular, we're all kids of either immigrants, refugees, working class parents, and we've had education really change our lives. So on a personal level, both my parents grew up with very little in Pakistan, and scholarships to study abroad in the UK and the US really changed their lives and the opportunities they could afford their kids as well. So super excited to be investing in technologies that make that kind of journey less reliant on luck.
And how do you make that work then? How is life living out of a suitcase and changing countries each month?
Love it. I have come to realize how lucky I am to be able to do that and how unique of a role it is. Given that most of what I do is over Zoom calls, we have a very distributed network. I spend half my time working with our group of venture partners. So probably the best place to start is when I say investor, people generally get what that is. When I say head of platform, a lot of people are like, what does that even mean? It's a relatively new. So let me start with that first. When you ask what is platform, you get many different answers, but the simplest way to describe what platform is all the value add a VC gives you as a founder other than the money. So it's how you support your portfolio companies to grow and flourish post investment. It's super interesting. We can go into a lot more detail, but over the last 2 decades, like platform roles have really skyrocketed. But our approach to platform, which is different depending on which VC you speak to, is building a venture partner community of the 100 best founders, operators, and executives in the future of learning and workspace who have built the best companies and can advise founders at earlier stages in their journeys. And as you can imagine, these folks are based everywhere from the US to Singapore to the Middle East to Europe. So I'm usually on a Zoom call with someone in a completely different country. And so because of that, I am very lucky to be able to work from anywhere in the world. Has spent the last 5 years living in places from Bosnia to Argentina to Japan, and I really, really love it.
And you touched on communities and bringing together founders. How important is that?
For me, actually, the first 3 years of my role, that was all I did and all I thought about day in, day out. And I think it's extremely valuable because if you want to be more competitive than another VC, because now the game is how can you show your dollar is worth more than another VC's dollar? I think the power of community is an incredibly impactful way to do it, particularly if you are a sector focused firm. I think community is valuable because there are people who really understand the ins and outs of the industry. And if you take, I don't know, retention metrics, for example, if you're building in consumer, what good looks like is going to be wildly different to what good looks like in EdTech. If you have people that have been on that journey already, they can save you making a lot of the mistakes that they've seen or even done themselves and help really accelerate your path to product market fit and beyond. And I think being able to hone into expertise from people who built unicorn companies in this space, public companies, people who've invested in this space for decades is extremely valuable.
And you touched on a bit about differentiating investors. What do you think makes a good VC investor or an investor in general?
It's a great question. I think maybe a more interesting way to frame an answer to this is what makes a good investor versus a great investor. So I think good investors, what do you need to do? You need to be able to spot promising companies. You need to be able to have an opinion about where the world is headed and what you need to invest in today to build that future tomorrow. You need to be clear with companies about what your value add is to them because you need to pitch yourself as much as a company needs to pitch them. Yeah. So I think those are generally some of the key traits that make a good investor. What it takes to make a great investor, I think it's someone who actually shapes companies, sits in the trenches with the founder, and really helps bend the odds at key inflection points in that journey. Is someone who can really articulate why, as I mentioned, their dollar is worth more to that company than another investor's dollar. I think getting a really good pitch as an investor as to why your input can really shape that company, especially if you're an investor at early stage, is really, really important. And I also saw a great LinkedIn post. I think it was today. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the person who posted it, but they posted about great investors being willing to be contrarian and disagreeable. And I think that's important, like being able to have a spiky viewpoint about why a company that people have written off or don't believe in is actually going to change the world. And if you look at any of the big tech companies that power our lives, from Airbnb to Uber, that was the case. No one could imagine going and living in a stranger's home or getting in a stranger's car. And yet, look at the world today. So I think that those are some of the key points to be a great investor.
How does one form a contrarian view? Like, what do you think are the things that go into that?
I think it's really hard because I mean, would love to delve deeper into the gripes I have with the education system. That one of the things that it
Yeah,
does, I think, make it harder. We train people to think in one way and to see the world in one way, when actually that's not the case, and that's not what really gets you far in life either. So I think to be contrarian is a very unique skill set, even within VC. And what it requires is it requires you to take time to really sit and think about how you see the world today and where you believe it's going to be in 10, 20, 30 years. And I will caveat this by saying if anyone can say with certainty where the world is going to be in a few decades, either they have magical powers or they're definitely lying, because with AI, it's just made everything, 100 times less predictable than before. But I think having a view on what is a really desirable future and like what does the world need at the moment? What are the key problems and what are the ways to get there? And I think one is like understanding what are the views that people generally believe to be true that we take for granted and we all just agree without saying. And like maybe within that, there are a few that you disagree with, or you think that there's some nuance missing, for example. And I think exploring that is a great way to figure out what are your contrarian viewpoints. And as an investor, and you're seeing a bunch of different companies, there might be one or two that your colleagues have written off or other people in the VC world won't fund. That there's just something in you that's like, maybe this idea sounds really crazy, or maybe the founder doesn't come from a typical type of background to found a breakout company, but there's just something about this that I'm really, really excited about. That's, figure out what that is, and that's probably your contrarian viewpoint.
and do you have any examples of companies you've invested in or companies that you've seen that have been written off, and either you or someone else has seen something others haven't, and they've gone on to do well?
We have actually just signed a term sheet with a great one, and I can't talk about it publicly
Of
yet.
course.
There's another one still in stealth, but what I can say is they operate in pharma, and they're taking on a big incumbent worth, I think, $45 billion. And so that has scared off a lot of investors. I would say the founder's profile is really, really fantastic. So a lot of people are brought on board with that. But I think being able to see that there is a insanely incumbent company in a space who has, I think it's like 80% market penetration, maybe even higher. And being able to imagine that actually, if you were founded in 2012, you're probably not built on infrastructure that can adapt to the world of AI. And we actually will need a whole suite of tools that are AI native. And now you have two areas that make it extremely difficult to do that. One is like pharma is a really hard market to crack. And two, you have an incumbent that has insanely deep pockets and has built deep, deep relationships with the industry. So, these two things make it a really difficult bet. And for us, I think it was the thesis that it is really difficult for a company that's not AI native to compete in this world going forward and be able to actually allow their customers to harness the true value of their data, of their contacts, all of these things. And then the second one was belief in the founders.
Going on for the belief in the founders. So obviously the founder is a huge part? Like how important is the founder? Like, do they constitute 20% of the investment thesis or 100%, or is the business model more important? What do you think on that?
Every investor has their own thesis, or let's say equation, on how they come to an investment decision. And I think that differs per investor, but it also differs a lot depending on what stage you invest. And we're early stage investors, which personally to me is the most exciting stage to invest. And for
Sure.
early stage investments, I would posit that honestly, when it comes down to it, there are only really two things that are important. One is the founders, and the other one is the market, because projections will change. I think numbers at early stage, great if you have them to share, but we don't take them so seriously because all of that changes. Product, in all likelihood, will change. Your whole approach to a particular problem could change and pivot, as many companies have. What will stay the same is, on the founder side, do you believe this founder has the grit, the resilience to get through this journey, which is certainly not easy. And if you're looking at venture exits, that's a 7 to 10 year journey minimum. Do they have the charisma, the passion to bring the best people on that journey with them? Whether you're talking about attracting great talent to come and build it, or attracting future investors as well. That's really important. And overall, why is there great founder market fit? We talk a lot about product market fit, but what does this founder uniquely know that enables them to do really well, tackling this specific problem? And then the other thing is market. Generally, like, do you believe that this market has potential, is growing, genuinely experiences this problem? Because I think that's one of the main reasons that founders maybe don't get investment, is that they've built a great product and maybe it's a problem for a few very small niche of users, but they haven't validated that this is a burning pain point, number one, because that's the reason people pay for things, and number two, for enough people to make this an actual venture scale solution.
And how does one assess the magnitude of a problem?
Talking to customers. Whenever someone comes to me and they are doing customer research, I ask them, how many customers have you spoken to? And almost always you can say, go away and add a zero to that number and then come back. The best way to know if you have really found a problem worth tackling is speaking to potential customers and being really careful about, research hygiene. Are you asking leading
Yeah.
questions? Because when you ask someone, hey, I built this product, I'm really excited about it, and I'm about to pour the next 7 to 10 years of my life into it, what do you think? Most people are not going to tell you, sorry, that's crap. Or like,
Yeah.
I would never use that, and I don't know anyone that would use that. They're going to be like, that's great. That's very different to saying, hey, could you tell me about the top 3 problems you experience in your job today? Because that's where the real information is. So making sure that you've spoken to as many customers as possible and validated with no leading questions in what you ask them, that this is really something that they experience day in, day out, that is causing them a lot of pain. And then the third part, which is, I can't stress how important this is, that they or their company would be willing to pay for it, because that's very different to having a free solution that people like to use or might use a few times a month, but will put their money where their mouth is. Those are the key things, really.
Say you've interviewed 200 customers, you've got the feeling there's a pain point, a couple of them are paid. How do you work out from there, or like try and predict, will thousands of customers pay like this? Or how have you seen founders do that?
Well, I think first, if your ratio is you've spoken to 200 and two are paying, then you probably have a problem somewhere in there, and maybe it's that you don't have product market fit. But let's say more than two. Let's say you have, like, 20, 30, maybe 50. 50 would be great. But whatever that number is, you have some traction with people. And there's two groups here of the 200 you've spoken to, and both groups will give uniquely important insight into what you're building. There's the group that gave you feedback, probably positive, but didn't convert into paying customers. And then there's a group that did convert. The kind of questions you ask them are super important, because with the group that did convert, you want to understand, what was the trigger point for you saying, all right, I'm going to pay for this, number one. And two, how recurring is that? Are they doing it just to try it out? Because let's say you have like a monthly subscription, for example, and you get really, really excited about that, but it turns out actually your churn is really high because people are paid for the first month to see what it's about, and the value add wasn't high enough to keep them using the product. So I think it's really important to stay on track and figure out what was the selling point, and is it more curiosity, or oh my god, this is really solving a need for me, and is that going to lead to like good retention? And then on the other side, with people that didn't sign up, that's still really, really valuable. I think one mistake people make is they just concentrate on the number of people that converted and focus on them. It's really useful to know, of the rest of the people that didn't convert, why didn't they convert? What would make them convert? It could be that actually, one of the important things is figuring out who your ICP is, your ideal customer profile. Maybe some of those people were actually not in your ICP. And you refine that as you go as well. Like, part of customer discovery is figuring out who that is and being really strict with yourself in most cases. Only go after those people. And I think particularly with B2B, where the cost per customer early on is very high, because usually you're doing a lot of personalization to win each customer. When I speak to founders that have built massive companies in the B2B space, they were super, super regimented with understanding who their ICP was and only building for them. Because it can be really easy to not have the discipline to say no to someone, especially if they're willing to pay in the early days for your product because they don't fit your ICP. And the reason that's important is because within your ICP, you want to create such customer love and build a product that is so good for that ICP that, they tell their friends, they tell their colleagues, and it expands from there. The only way to build a product like that is when you're so focused on what you're doing that it's clear that every product and every feature that you're building within your product is built for that particular profile and use case. And you can't do that if you're spreading yourself too thin and selling to anyone that will give you money. So I think particularly in B2B, like, having that knowledge of your ICP is so important.
And how do you balance niche defined ICP and market size? So I imagine if you're niching down on your ICP, you're limiting your initial customer.
I'd say almost all companies that have done really well have been very niche to begin with and then have expanded from there. And, I think most investors will give you that advice. Maybe there's some fringe cases where this isn't true, but the best way to like build a big company is to go deep into a niche, build something people love, build a brand reputation, gain really, really good learnings, and then expand from there. So maybe it's like, you build for one sector, right? And then as you're building that out, often you actually find out that people are asking to use your product, and you might say no in the early days, but you realize that of the people that ask, they tend to be in this other sector that's kind of adjacent. Great, you've realized there's a whole other sector that has this problem. Great founders actually think about this in advance, and they're like, hey, we're going to start. We've done 200 300 customer discovery calls. We've noted these are the 3 industries, or these are the 3 personas that experience this problem the most deeply. We're going to start with this one because they experience the problem most urgently, or because they have the biggest budget, whatever that reason is. Then you start expanding from there. So it's really important to show to an investor that you've thought about the total addressable market, the serviceable addressable market within that, so how many you could actually service of that, and then your serviceable obtainable market. So of all the people that potentially could use your product, what percentage do you think you could actually reasonably sell to? And then kind of work your way from there.
And moving on to more EdTech. So obviously EdTech is great and the social value it provides, but it's also very difficult, in my opinion, to monetize education and balance commercial viability with social value. Like, how do you see companies doing this?
It's true. EdTech is freaking hard. I think on the balancing the social value and profitability point, I do believe it is something to behold that we live in a time where you can do good and make money at the same time. Like, I think that's incredible. It's a relatively new concept historically. If you are perfectly aligned with your mission, you shouldn't have to choose between making money and making social impact. Because if you're doing something like, I don't know, let's take Handshake as a business that's helping students access employment opportunities, the more money you make, i.e., the more they monetize by selling to companies, the more companies you get on board and open up opportunities, the more students you can match. So the more money you make, the more impact you can have. And so if you're closely aligned, generally the two should go hand in hand. The difficulty, I would say, on that is equally distributing social impact, because impact can mean many, many things, right? You can be impactful to people that are experiencing a problem really, really deeply. but actually, they have money and are generally like white collar workers, for example. Or you can be solving a problem for blue collar workers and frontline workers, for example. But there are regions of the world, for example, with very low disposable income. And I would say it's very, very hard to build a venture product for them, because monetizing that, even if it's non-directly and you're monetizing via B2B, it's really, really hard. So, it depends on what your social value is. But, in terms of your question on like the difficulties of EdTech, I think there are a lot of things unique about the sector that make it really hard. There are long sales cycles, whether it's institutions and enterprises you're selling to, they move very slowly if you're doing B2B EdTech. And it makes it hard for startups to scale revenue really quickly. You have fragmented buyers, schools, employers, individuals, each has different budgets, incentives, decision processes. And often with EdTech, one of the challenges is you actually have to sell twice. There are more use cases than not within learning and like workforce where you have to sell twice to either you're selling to an employer and the person that uses your product is their employee. So you've got to sell to them, but you also have to sell to the employee to get their buy-in, because if they're not using your product, the employer isn't going to pay for it. On the flip side, maybe you're building a product for kids or students. Who's actually paying for it? It's parents or it's schools, it's teachers. So you have to sell to them, but also sell to the end user of your product. It's rare. It's not impossible, but it's rare that the person paying for your product is actually the one using it. Maybe that's the category of adult learning, but very often you have to sell to two different stakeholders. I think unlike most consumer apps, you need this proof of impact. Buyers often demand measurable learning outcomes before committing to a product. And there's a lot of different reasons that it's really hard, but I think the impact compounds differently. Every marginal improvement in learning or widening access is reshaping people's futures. And I think that's what makes the struggle really, really worth it.
And what do you see that is working in EdTech in both B2B and B2B?
It's a great question. We actually did a really good analysis on like the different areas within learning and AI that are really exciting in the space. So we had a look at what was getting funded, what was doing well. I think, with AI, the exciting thing is you can scale impact much faster than traditional ed tech. We look at ed tech to kind of go back and take a larger view of the sector as kind of one way of looking at it is you are going from pre-K to gray, right? That's, if you think of it as a lifelong journey of learning, that's kind of what it is. And the thing about EdTech is everyone has some sort of experience with education, which tends to conjure up this idea of, education is sitting in a room with rows of seats facing a whiteboard. And as you've said, I think one of the biggest success cases of EdTech has been in B2B, and people maybe don't think about one of the areas of the future of learning is actually selling to an employer who then distributes a learning experience to their employee. So I think like one is recognizing, and this is where a lot of funding has gone to, is like EdTech is about way more than just schools and universities. We kind of think about EdTech as having come in three waves. So the first wave is like, we call it the Stone Age, and I'll get to like what is most exciting at the moment, which is the original question. But if you look at EdTech in 2010 to 2014, there was a lot of ambition and excitement, not as much money and realism of where the market was at that point, willingness to pay, what people actually needed, could handle. But I think that was kind of the early days of conceiving what EdTech could do. The second wave, if you think about it as more like classical EdTech, 2015 to 2021, is the period at which I think a lot of today's unicorns were founded. That's centered around content, places, digitizing education in a way, moving it from textbooks to your screen, and increasing access through better affordability. So I think there was a lot of impact through that wave as well. And I'm saying this sort of in contrast to maybe what is working and taking off now, which is why I'm going through these different periods. The third wave, which is what I would say is exciting at the moment, we think of this as like EdTech's renaissance. This period was started and I would say like driven by AI, and we expect to see a lot more technological and product breakthroughs, really moving the needle against learning impact in particular. And I'd say like this is an insane time to be in EdTech, because like the best products we're seeing in, like, let's take consumer, they're getting to 10 million in revenue in under 18 months. there's no precedent for that in this sector before, or like other sectors as well. Like, I mean, it's just an entirely different magnitude these days. And so what's working well? I would say companies that are AI native and thinking about this from the ground up, because in majority of cases, if you're not thinking about it that way, you will be outcompeted. Companies that are still, I think, there was a lot of around different things like data as a moat, but actually like the key moats of today are the ones that were relevant 10 years ago. It's like the founder, go to market, all of these things. And so I think still it's like people that have a really unique go to market insight. I think in terms of education, it's people that understand what are what are individuals' motivations for learning, and what are the different types of learning, like thinking about it outside of the box of just of sitting in a classroom and memorizing a textbook and spitting that back out. It's like, what do employers need? Where are employees, for example? And how do we bake learning into the flow of work? Because I think one of the biggest areas that we're seeing funding go into, or like calls for people to build in, is like, how do you create learning experiences that are just in time learning? Because no one has time even in the middle of their jobs to go and take an hour out and watch, a course on something, or like go read a textbook. And by the time you've gotten to your work, you've forgotten it already. And the best way to learn is really applying it and what you're doing. So I think one of the exciting areas in EdTech, and this can be whether it's consumer or like you're doing B2B, it's actually implementing the learning in the process at which and at the time at which that learning is relevant.
And moving on to the education system. So I think you've touched on it a little bit, that you had your gripes of the education system. And yeah, I totally get with that. I think the education definitely does teach uh, more of a one track way of thinking, let's say. I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on the education system, the pros and the cons, and what you think should improve.
Well, and generally I'm an optimist. And the reason that I'm in this industry is because I think technology can really shift the dynamics we have with education. So I am optimistic about that. But coming back to the original question about my gripes, I think the tragedy of the modern education system is not what we teach, but it's what we kill in the process of traditional education. We have essentially, with schools, built factories for certification when we should be, building gardens for curiosity to grow in kids, right? Like a lot of people don't know, but the actual root of the word for education comes from educare, which means to bring out, to lead forth or nurture. But if you look at schools, what are we really nurturing in kids? We don't nurture wonder. We don't nurture like an insatiable hunger to understand the world around us, not a sense of empathy for our fellow human beings or a responsibility to uphold what we believe is right. But we teach kids to shrink their questions into like multiple choice answers, to measure their worth in what grade they get on a test, to mistake, oh, I've memorized a lot of information from a textbook for understanding. And there are a ton of really important things we don't teach: money, nutrition, relationships, health. But I think the worst part might be how we train away agency, because kids are born agentic. As soon as they're able to move by themselves, if they see something they want, they will go out and grab it. And you can be sure they're going to put it in their mouth, even if it's a shoe, right? Like they will go out and get whatever they want. But in school, I think, every raised hand waiting for permission, every correct way to solve a problem, every arbitrary rule about when you can speak or move and create, these are invisible chains we put around a child's instinct to be creative and to learn through play, right? And we teach them that authority always comes from outside, that there are rules in place for a reason, and success means following a predetermined path. And I think that's why we're seeing, I'm seeing a lot of tweets and posts on LinkedIn about kids today coming from world-class institutions like Harvard, Oxford, Yale, struggling to find a job in today's market, because these are bright, hardworking kids with the right, box ticked on their resume. I'm not even beginning to talk about people that don't fit into that mold. They were told if they follow a certain path, if they tick the right boxes, success would naturally follow. But the world is changing, and it's always been changing. But I think what's different now is it's changing at an exponential rate that is highlighting just how much we have messed up with having such rigid systems. And many will spend their adult lives unlearning what they were taught at school, that you need permission to start something, that there's only one right answer to a question, that mistakes are failures rather than experiments. And I think the biggest irony there is that the skills we'll actually need most, which is creativity, adaptability, resilience, agency, are exactly what our education system or traditional systems tend to flatten. We are preparing students for a world that's already vanishing and teaching them to be good at things that machines ultimately will do better while neglecting the very qualities that make us uniquely human.
People becoming more agentic, having more agency. How do you see that changing?
I think the agency point is it's really hard to do that at scale because I think there is a reason I can be very critical about the education system. There's a reason when you're dealing with that many kids and your funding is that restrained that we've essentially created like, factories to produce workers, right? To put it one way. I think the one way that I see it changing and one reason that I'm really excited at the moment, they're for smaller groups of kids and generally for more affluent families. But there are new schools that have recognized that actually we're not teaching the most critical skills of tomorrow. There are new universities. Just to list off a few, if you're looking at really early years for young kids, there's Bina School. If you're looking for high school kids, there's School of Humanity. If you're looking at university level, one of our portfolio companies is Tomorrow University. All three of these are just one example in each age group of founders who are trying to build something that teaches agency among all the other skills that you need in today's world to succeed. And so I think the more funding that goes into these things, the more accessible they become, the more they influence traditional learning as well. I think at some point traditional education will follow, but it requires trailblazers, it requires parents taking their money out of the system because you vote with your money, right? Taking their kids out of that and putting them in schools like this. I think, unfortunately, in many ways, having the most exciting and most relevant skills taught in smaller groups where parents can afford to take risks traditionally, where they can pay for private schooling, it means that it's not equally distributed, the benefits of that, but this will change over time. And so I think the best way is to revamp our curriculums, and educators, but also policymakers really need to have a deep think about actually, is our education system serving the students of today, and what changes do we need to make? And traditional education is partnering a lot with EdTech solutions. And I think that will only increase to be able to actually cater to the rapid change that needs to happen within our systems.
And founders have generally gone through the same education system, but they seem to have completely different levels of agency and going out, changing the world. What do you think are the causes of this level of agency?
There's some really good studies on what makes a good founder. I think it's very hard to determine correlation versus causation. But I think traditionally, you see stamps like have gone to a really good school, have, gone and worked at companies that are a rubber stamp on your CV. That's where people have traditionally funded founders and funneled money into. But actually, when you look at the statistics, what are things that stand out? Immigrant founders really stand out, people that have faced some sort of struggle and persevered, because resilience is one of the top traits needed for founders. I think you need this crazy balance of like humility, but also arrogance, because there is some level of arrogance, and I say this in a positive way, to believe that you can build $1 billion company from nothing. Like, that's an insane feat. And so I think you need some level of self-confidence and drive. I think almost like pressure to believe that like, this needs to work. Like, very often founders that have built amazing companies, they've left maybe a safe career behind and have gone all in on this venture. So there is some level of pressure that like, I don't have an option. This really, really needs to work. And they've also found that founders that have done well, living in different countries and experiencing different cultures has also been one of the commonalities. I think like having a broad understanding, but also I think this curiosity, it comes back to that, like being really relentlessly curious, and asking why a lot. So I think like a lot of people find out the problem that they end up working on because they've either experienced it firsthand or through discovering, they've spoken to a lot of people of a certain profile and they realized that they all had this problem, and they just kept asking like, why do you experience this? And that's how they got to the bottom of that. So I think like a combination of factors, but people who have always been maybe branded as rebels or like rule breakers, a lot of them got into trouble at school for these reasons. And yeah, I would say like it is quite rare, but founders tend to fall into that sort of profile of someone who's always seen the world a bit differently. as a kid maybe had more trouble with following rules and didn't make sense to them, and have had high agency in choosing a path that maybe doesn't make sense to other people but makes sense to them. And risk taking is one of the other traits. So being comfortable with taking big risks.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think when you speak about the agency and founders and talking about how school takes away the agency, I think what I've seen in a lot of books I've read and in my life experience is that a lot of founders have struggled with like neurodiversity at school, and then that they haven't been able to fit into school systems, so they've just formed their own worldview, and then that's allowed them to go on and change the world. So yeah, I think some really interesting points you raised on that. I'd be curious to understand your founding of Adventure and like founding history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I never thought I would end up in VC. I always thought I would end up more on the startup side. And the whole story around how I ended up in my role. But long story short, fell in love with the team and the mission that convinced me to join the investing side. But prior to that, I had always built companies on the side and founded small startups. Like it's what I really enjoyed doing. Before I joined Emerge, the what I was working on was Adventure, which was the largest pan-European university incubator. And I love this idea of entrepreneurship as a tool to solve the world's most pressing issues. And I'd also observed that most people going on to found companies, or at least the people that had the best storytelling around what they were doing, tended to be men. They tended to be folks that had come from STEM backgrounds. They tended, to come from, like, there were a lot of people excluded from the definition of entrepreneurship that we see from the media, from LinkedIn, etc. And I wanted more people to see entrepreneurship as a viable career path. Particularly, I was frustrated with the most ambitious, talented minds of our time going and spending their times working in investment banks, for example, or like joining a consulting company when they could be having way more impact if they were founding a company, particularly at the stage in your life where you have the least to lose. You don't have to support a family. You're not already signed up making big bucks. It's a massive firm where you have to turn away from that. This is arguably, my belief is like that was the best time to start a company, because if it failed, so what, and that's like one of the best learnings to then take into whatever you do next, or founding another company. And universities specifically are this melting pot of everything you need to build a great startup. You have fresh ideas, diversity, tenacity, and an understanding of what is going on in the world, but just enough optimism to believe that you can actually make a change, right? It's that humility, arrogance paradigm. And so my brilliant co-founders and I would all founded startups in the few years before that, and so we knew what a challenge it could be to do it alone as well. We realized the biggest concerns were, if you're young, particularly in Europe, US is very good at storytelling, but also funding and inspiring young minds on campuses across the country to believe that they can build companies. And I think Europe needs to do a much better job of that. So I'm really excited about things like Project Europe, for example, that are inspiring young people to do that. But, at this time, there wasn't anything really like that. And funding was an issue. People are very conservative in Europe with funding young founders that don't have experience. Meeting co-founders is really hard, particularly meeting co-founders outside of your discipline, because if you're in humanities, you have relatively few opportunities in the UK system in particular to meet people in STEM. And actually, that's a great combination. And then getting industry connections is hard. Eventually, we wanted to maximize the potential of like the brightest minds across European universities by catering to that, providing useful resources, tools, funding, an incredible long-lasting network, matching you with founders. So that's why we did that. And initially it was for students, by students. It was a non-profit. We ran it for free, and we never ever wanted students to pay a single pound for this program. It ended up becoming a business when universities approached us and said, hey, we'd love to pay you to run this for us, because some of them had entrepreneurship programs, some of them did not, but they were really struggling to attract the number and diversity of applicants that we were. And I will also add that, when we launched, we were very grateful to receive so much support from folks, because we built the program and we were like, hey, we're three kids that have built small startups in before, but really, who are we to be teaching a curriculum on how to build a unicorn company? And so it was COVID at the time. And I remember calling up, like, we were living in Scotland. I went to University of Edinburgh. I called up every unicorn founder that has come out of Scotland and said, hey, will you teach this course for us? And they all, granted it's 3, they all said yes. So we actually, we received a lot of support from folks who just wanted to give back. And so we had amazing world-class teachers teach our course. And so that's how it started to get traction and be noticed. And I must have sent hundreds of cold emails just for that first cohort and putting that together. So it was a really wonderful experience. Prior to that, I built UCAN, much smaller scale as well. I wouldn't even necessarily call it a startup. I didn't think of it as that. I was in school actually when I started and the beginning of university. But the focus was also on lifting human potential, and we were supporting students with post-school options because I'd noticed that some schools were really good at flagging what are your options post university, helping students with applying and then UCAS. Some schools didn't talk about it at all, and either they didn't talk about university applications as much or support people, or they talked about it only in the country of the applicant, but they never said, hey, maybe you want to apply to the UK or elsewhere. So founded a company that matched high school students with university students for support. So they would speak to someone that's studying at their dream university who's been through that process and been in their shoes relatively recently to support them in that journey. And I really loved working with students at that age because I think a single sentence early on in someone's sort of journey can really alter someone's life trajectory. Maybe it's like, hey, have you thought about studying this subject? Or like, have you ever considered this particular career path? Or like, oh, you're really good at science. Like, actually, we need more girls in STEM. And I think like that was really exciting to me. There's an amazing mini essay from Tyler Cohen on the high return activity of raising other people's aspirations. But essentially, there are these critical moments in time where you can raise the aspirations of other people by a large margin, especially at that age, just by suggesting that they maybe do something more ambitious than what they have in mind, or suggesting, that, hey, university is for people like you. I know none of your family have ever gone to university. Your teachers may have written you off, but I believe you can do it. And it costs you nothing to do that, but the benefit to them and also to the world in general, depending on what they go on to do, can be enormous. I really truly believe it's one of the most high leverage things you can do with your life. It's not just what you build, but who you help other people become and what they go on to build.
Yeah, I think what you've touched on there is like insanely valid in the sense that I think, as you said, one of the biggest leverage things we could do in society is actually get people to realize what they're capable of. Like, I remember when I used to live in my hometown, being 16, you don't see much success, so you just automatically assume it's not possible. You come to London, and like my worldview's changed. Like I've gone up, my ambition's gone up 1,000%. I'm like, wow, there must be so many people, like so much talent distributed around the world who just they can't see their full potential, therefore they write themselves off. So yeah, I think that's so interesting you say that, and I think yeah, it's a really great point. And moving on from the EdTech side of moving on from EdTech founding, if you were founding an EdTech tomorrow, what would you found, or what area would it be in? Do you think?
That is a great question. EdTech specifically, or any industry?
Any industry, actually, any industry.
I am definitely partial to education for sure. I'd say education and climate. But one area that I have been thinking about a lot more recently, particularly reflecting on my travels and trying to figure out the commonalities between what people are struggling with, I think is the area of connection. Because we have thought about tech in a way that's like, how can I make my life more efficient? How can I optimize things? How can I do things faster, better, cheaper? And if you actually look at depression rates, there's a lot of reasons that this is the case, but they are skyrocketing. And a lot of people are deeply unhappy or unsatisfied with their lives. We're less connected than ever. I think one of the consequences of the loss of religion, of people moving to big cities, is that people just don't have that community that we once did. Social media also makes it feel really, really hard to deeply connect with people and be our authentic selves. So you know, this is a more broad kind of reflection on the areas an area that I'm really, really excited about is how can we use technology to bring people back to the feeling of really connecting with other people? And, I think there's a few companies doing exciting things in the space. One of them, for example, is Time Left. If you haven't seen it, I think they're really good at Instagram ads. They bring you together with, I think it's like 7 strangers in a city for dinner. So you sign up, you don't know who you're going to meet, you show up to this dinner and you meet 7 new people. And I really like that concept of like, it's really hard as an adult to meet new people, particularly if you're not extremely extroverted, because you
Yeah.
don't, you're not especially outside of your job, you're not in school. The rise of remote working also makes it really hard. And I think more things that get people out of their comfort zone to do that, but also, take the planning out of it. They're like, hey, you sign up to this and we'll do the rest for you. So I really like the idea of using technology to bring more connection to people's lives and, not just make things cheaper, faster, better. But if we're thinking about all the time, like there's a lot of talk about longevity, which I think is super important. We're focused on how do we increase people's lifespan and health span. But I would love to see more companies focus on how do we increase people's, lack of a better word, joy span, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're living a healthier, longer life, we want it to be a happier one too. So probably it would be in that area.
Yeah. 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 You're preaching to the choir there. It's so interesting you say that because I was actually speaking about this yesterday, and I was speaking to someone who said they founded a running club and it just got 50 members like that. And I think anything you found in big cities like London, people are moving from around the world to new places. People tend to be less connected, less lonely. I think there's huge demand for anything, like you say, using tech to solve these issues, whether it's like events companies, meeting new people for dinner. So yeah, I find it quite coincidental you said that because I was thinking this last night. Like, that is an absolute killer space with loads of opportunity and like loads of social value. And it'll be interesting to see what comes in that space.
For sure.
Yeah. And last question. I'm always curious to hear what people think on this. Like, do you have like a best book you've read or a guiding principle or a best piece of advice? Is there anything, that sticks with you?
Let's go with guiding principle or advice. I'd say it's two part. And I actually just wrote, I have my Emerge blog on Medium where I post work related content. And I released my first very personal blog piece on, the guiding principles of my life. And I'd say, probably the first two that I start with in that, it's two parts. The first is really ingesting the idea that life is malleable. And so one of the most fundamental mindset shifts that's unlocked many of the opportunities that have contributed to my life that I'm super grateful for is the realization that you have more power to shape your life than people think. And there's that great Steve Jobs quote that's like all the rules in the world were made up by someone no smarter than you, right? And you can change it, you can influence it, etc. And I remember like as a kid growing up, I hated rules. Went to school where you had to wear a tie and a blazer, and I was often branded. I liked my teachers. I think they liked me as well, but I was often called naughty or rebellious. And I can't say that's changed too much. But what did change is understanding that post school, you realize that a lot of the rules that existed in school were like social, I don't know, they were inherited habits. That's what rules are. You're told to do something because it's maybe an exercise in authority because I told you so. You need to learn discipline. These are like social scripts dressed up as structure, and people don't really question them. And you definitely get punished for questioning rules as a kid. But it helps to internalize that actually as an adult, this is not the case. Internalize that life and rules both are very malleable, and you can talk to that person. You can ask for a promotion. You can ask someone out. You can move countries and start new. Whatever it is that you want to do, you can just do things. I sound so American. I see it all the time on tech
So
Twitter.
true
But yeah,
though.
it's basically you can just do things. So which leads me to part two. If the first part was more of a mindset shift, like understanding very deeply that life is malleable. The second one is what do you do with that? What is the behavior shift that needs to come with that to actually profit from that mindset shift? And it's basically like to always look for a side door because we're taught to treat life like a bureaucratic process. If you want to be a lawyer, a consultant, a psychologist, fantastic. Here's your checklist. Here's what you need to study in school, the grades you need to get, the process you need to go through, the internship you need to be able to apply. Here's the long line queue like everyone else. And there are some paths like medicine, for example, where I think those hoops are much more real and rigid, and you can't just, call up and be like, hey, I'd love to be a neurosurgeon tomorrow. I don't have the experience that, thought I'd put my shot in. But for most other people, they are not laws of nature. These are norms that we've mistaken for necessity. More often than not, things are bendable. And I think the biggest lie that we're taught is that there's one way into an opportunity that we want. But often, whatever the main door is, it's crowded or it's slow or it's not built for people like you or you don't meet all of the requirements. And I've seen it firsthand. And actually, there's a big difference also between genders in terms of like what you apply to based on the percentage of requirements officially that you meet. And so more men are likely to apply even if they don't meet all the requirements than women. But I've seen it firsthand. There were roles that I got where I was told that I was not qualified for. Um, Lots that seemed shut that ended up opening when I took the side route. There was an internship I really wanted in Jordan when I was living there for 5 months, and they told me, oh, we don't take students because I was studying at the time, and also was very far from fluent in Arabic. And they rejected my application, and I just showed up at their office and I said, hey, can you give me 20 minutes with the managing partner? I will work for free or like a small stipend. Try me out for like 2 weeks and then decide. And they took a chance on me, and I was there for I think the whole 5 months or close to it. But that wouldn't have happened if I didn't decide to go straight to the decision maker. And maybe it wouldn't have worked. And I can't say it's always worked, but all the opportunities that I have got have come from doing something a little bit differently. And I think we lose a lot of possibilities in life because we don't think to look for them, or the first no, we're like, all right, that's the final answer. But I think once you start seeing how many opportunities you can get, how many opportunities people have that you admire actually came through like a side door, you begin to realize how often like this process is really just theater, and the real game is played somewhere else. And I think it's unfortunate because often it's people of privilege that are told very early on that you've got to
Yeah.
ask for what you want, or maybe that are hooked up to connections. But there are ways to do that without that privilege. And it's, I think, ingesting this information, particularly if you don't come from a place of privilege, is so, so important, because you lose a ton of opportunity by following this prescribed process that everyone else does. So look for the side door, ask people often, ask them politely and nicely, and be prepared for no. That's the best thing. Be comfortable with hearing no, but ask as much as possible.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I fully resonate with that. I think everything you said there just got like the cogs going and made me think of two quotes. And one's like Wayne Gretzky, where he said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." And another one was like Mark Twain. It's like, if you tell yourself you can or you tell yourself you can't, you're right. So it's a bit cringy putting it all into quotes, but I think there's just so much truth to what you said. That's what it reminded me of. So yeah. But yeah, Zara, thank you ever so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Love your way of thinking and everything we spoke about. And it was amazing you having you on. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex. Really enjoyed it.